What if I told you that right now, at this very moment, you're living through the early stages of another Great Depression? And what if everyone around you is too distracted to notice? In 1929, people woke up thinking they were rich. By lunch, their entire life savings had disappeared. Banks slammed their doors shut, families lost everything. And it happened so fast that most people didn't understand what hit them until it was already too late. Here's the terrifying part. The exact same warning signs are flashing red right now in 2025. The same patterns, the same mistakes, the same blind confidence that this time is different. But is it really different? Or are we just better at lying to ourselves? Stay with me, because what you're about to discover will completely change how you see every news headline about the economy, every bill you pay, and every promise politicians make about your future. Before we dive in, do me a quick favor. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I genuinely love seeing how these stories reach people across the entire planet. And if you want more content that actually makes you think, hit that subscribe button, because you're not going to hear this anywhere else. All right, let's go back to where it all started. Picture this. It's 1929. Jazz is playing on every radio. New cars are rolling off assembly lines. Skyscrapers are shooting up in every major city. The stock market? It's on fire. Everyone's getting rich. Teachers are buying stocks. Farmers are buying stocks. Factory workers who've never invested a single dollar in their lives are now playing the market like professional traders. And they're all doing it with borrowed money. The newspapers called it the new era of wealth. Sound familiar? Everyone genuinely believed the old rules didn't apply anymore. Technology was exploding. Credit was flowing like water. Politicians stood on stages promising endless growth, endless prosperity, endless progress. And behind all the champagne and celebration, something dangerous was building. Debt. Mountains and mountains of debt. All held together by one fragile thing: confidence. Here's what most people don't realize. In the years before the crash, it wasn't just stocks that were going crazy. Real estate prices were skyrocketing. Banks were handing out loans to anyone with a pulse. Companies were lying about their profits. Regular people were buying luxury items they absolutely couldn't afford, putting everything on payment plans. It was a culture built entirely on optimism and borrowed money. And like every debt-fueled party in human history, it ended the exact same way. October 1929. Suddenly, without warning, panic spread like wildfire. Investors stampeded to sell their shares. Prices didn't just drop, they collapsed. Within just a few days, billions of dollars in wealth simply vanished into thin air. The system that everyone thought was invincible cracked wide open. And underneath, there was nothing, just empty promises and paper dreams. But here's what you need to understand, and this is crucial. The crash wasn't the cause of the Great Depression. It was just the symptom. The real disease was much deeper. Too much debt, too little real income, and way too much faith in markets that only go up. Now, I want you to pause for a second and think about today. Does any of this sound familiar? Today, we're watching the exact same movie, just with different actors and better special effects. Instead of ticker tape machines and telegrams, we have trading apps and cryptocurrency charts. Instead of margin loans from stockbrokers, we have credit cards, student loans, mortgages, and governments running trillion-dollar deficits like it's completely normal. And the illusion? It's stronger than it's ever been. Modern economies run on consumption, but consumption depends on confidence, and confidence is incredibly fragile. When people believe the system is safe, they borrow, they spend, they invest. The moment they start to doubt, everything freezes. That's exactly what happened in 1929, and it's exactly what keeps economists awake at night in 2025. The real danger isn't the crash itself, it's what happens when trust disappears. Because when nobody believes the system will hold anymore, they stop playing the game entirely. Let's talk about debt for a minute, because this is where things get really uncomfortable. In 1929, household debt in the United States had exploded to levels never seen before. People were buying cars, radios, and houses they absolutely couldn't afford. They justified it by believing that wages and prices would keep rising forever. Fast forward today, global debt is now over 300% of the entire world's GDP. Think about that number. We owe 3 times more than the entire planet produces in a year. The pattern hasn't changed even slightly. We're still spending tomorrow's money to live today. Back then, banks packaged risky loans and sold them as opportunities. Today, they do the exact same thing, just with more complicated names and fancier packaging. They call them financial instruments and structured products. But underneath all the complexity, it's the same game. The instruments change, the psychology never does. During the 1920s, inequality hit historic levels. A tiny group of elites controlled most of the nation's wealth. Meanwhile, working people survived on credit and hope. When the bubble finally burst, they had absolutely nothing to fall back on. Look around you right now. The top 1% of people own more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. Let that sink in. Corporate profits are breaking records year after year. CEO salaries are astronomical. But wages for regular workers? They've barely moved. The middle class is being squeezed from every direction, and they're turning to debt just to maintain the lifestyle their parents had. It's the exact same script, just updated for a new century with smartphones and social media. In the late 1920s, the Federal Reserve kept interest rates low to fuel economic growth. Then, when inflation started appearing, they panicked and raised rates sharply. The result? A sudden liquidity crunch that choked credit markets and triggered absolute panic. Today, central banks around the world face the exact same impossible choice. Do they print more money to keep markets alive? Or do they raise interest rates to fight inflation? Both choices have serious consequences. And here's the truth nobody wants to admit. History is repeating itself in slow motion, right before our eyes. Then there's speculation. In 1929, regular people poured their life savings into stocks they didn't understand at all. Why? Because everyone else was doing it. Today, it's meme stocks, NFTs, and crypto bubbles. The psychology is absolutely identical. FOMO, greed, the belief in easy wealth without hard work. When prices are rising, people think they're smart investors. When prices fall, they suddenly realize they were just lucky. Or worse, they weren't even lucky. The Great Depression revealed one deeply uncomfortable truth that nobody wanted to accept. When systems become too unequal and too leveraged, they eventually collapse under their own weight. The question was never if, it was always when. Here's one major difference between then and now. In 1929, the financial system was smaller and more localized. When it collapsed, it destroyed millions of lives, absolutely devastating. But today, the financial system is completely global. A shock in one country ripples across entire continents in literal seconds. Money moves at the speed of light. Information travels instantly. That makes the stakes infinitely higher. A crisis today wouldn't just affect one nation, it would affect everyone, everywhere, all at once. What happened in 1929 wasn't just a financial failure, it was a failure of imagination. People genuinely believed that prosperity was permanent. They couldn't see how fragile the entire system actually was. The warning signs were everywhere, but nobody wanted to look at them. We're making the exact same mistake today. We're trusting central banks and politicians to keep everything stable. We believe they have it all under control. But stability that's built on debt and speculation isn't real stability. It's borrowed time, and the clock is ticking. The lesson of 1929 wasn't learned, it was forgotten. Because every single generation believes they're smarter than the one before, that they've engineered a safer system, that this time is different. But the patterns tell a completely different story. By the early 1930s, the illusion had completely shattered. Lines of desperate people stretched around street corners. Banks failed by the thousands. Families lost their homes, their savings, their hope, their dignity. What started as a financial panic turned into a full-blown social crisis. Governments scrambled to respond, but their tools were primitive. They cut spending trying to balance budgets. They raised tariffs to protect domestic industries. And they watched helplessly as unemployment skyrocketed. In their fear of short-term chaos, they made everything worse. The Great Depression became a decade-long wound that reshaped politics, economics, and faith in capitalism itself. Here's the uncomfortable truth: the same logic is visible everywhere today. When cracks start appearing in the economy, policymakers reach for the exact same tools: print money, cut interest rates, promise stability, calm the markets. But they're only treating symptoms, not causes. The global economy now floats on debt that will never, ever be fully repaid. It's held together by central bank intervention and public belief. That's it. And that belief, it's incredibly fragile. When it breaks, history doesn't repeat exactly, but it definitely rhymes. Let's talk about leverage. In the 1920s, investors were borrowing 90% of the value of their stock purchases. When prices fell even slightly, their loans got called in. Margin calls cascaded like dominoes, forcing mass liquidation and triggering a death spiral. In modern markets, leverage still exists, it's just hidden behind complexity. Hedge funds, derivatives, shadow banking systems, all magnifying small shocks into systemic threats. The mechanisms have evolved and become more sophisticated, but the core danger remains identical: too much risk, too little transparency, and way too much confidence in mathematical models built on assumptions that fall apart the moment reality shifts. During the Great Depression, trust collapsed first in the markets, then in the institutions themselves. Banks closed their doors overnight with zero warning, leaving depositors with absolutely nothing. In response, the US government created the FDIC. It worked for a while. But today, the scale is completely different. Banking is global now. When Silicon Valley Bank failed in 2023, panic spread instantly across international borders. The same fear of invisible losses, of vanishing safety, still lives just beneath the surface. What made 1929 so dangerous wasn't only the financial mechanics, it was psychological. The belief in endless progress had become like a religion. Prosperity was seen as destiny. When that myth shattered, people didn't just lose money, they lost trust in the system itself, in everything they'd been told, in everyone who'd made them promises. The danger today is remarkably similar. For decades, we've been told that central banks can control economic cycles, that policymakers can smooth out downturns, that recessions are relics of the past, problems that modern economics has solved. Yet every single fix requires more debt, more intervention, and more distortion of natural market forces. Each rescue plants the seeds for the next collapse. The Great Depression also revealed just how interconnected global economies had already become by 1929. When American markets fell, European banks that were already burdened by World War I debt collapsed immediately. Germany spiraled into economic crisis. And that economic collapse, it fed resentment, extremism, and political chaos. The world learned a hard lesson: economic pain doesn't stay contained within borders. Fast forward to right now. Global debt exceeds $300 trillion. A crisis in one corner of the world, whether it's a sovereign default, a currency devaluation, or a major bank failure, can ripple globally in minutes. The architecture is much larger now, but it's no sturdier. In fact, it might be more fragile. In 1929, policymakers genuinely thought they could restore confidence with speeches and small interventions. They completely misunderstood the disease. It wasn't panic, it was leverage. People weren't being irrational, they were overexposed. The exact same thing applies now. Central banks flood markets with liquidity, hoping that optimism will magically rebuild itself. But liquidity is not the same as solvency. Printing money doesn't create real value. It just delays the recognition of losses. And the longer those losses get delayed, the more violent the eventual correction becomes. Here's another echo from history. In the 1920s, asset prices soared far beyond any rational fundamentals. Investors justified it by claiming this time is different. New technology, new management techniques, new policies had supposedly made the old rules obsolete. Sound familiar? It should. Today, valuations stretch all logic again. Companies lose billions of dollars, yet trade at record-high prices. Why? Because markets expect endless growth. The same optimism blinds investors to underlying fragility. The names change. Instead of RCA and Bethlehem Steel, it's Tesla and startups with no profits and no path to profitability. But the psychology? Absolutely identical. Debt bubbles always end the same way. Confidence breaks, credit tightens, prices fall. The only question is timing. Before the 1929 crash, the wealth gap was extreme. The rich speculated in stocks and luxury goods. The poor survived on installment loans and hope. When the crash came, the losses were massively uneven. The wealthy had cushions, the poor had nothing. Today, inequality is actually worse. The top 1% own more than half of all global wealth. Asset inflation rewards those who already have assets. Wages stagnate or barely keep up with inflation. Debt fills the gap between income and lifestyle. The middle class feels wealthier when their home prices rise, but that wealth is borrowed, not earned. When interest rates increase, the illusion fades fast, and the social fabric starts to tear. The Great Depression gave birth to populism and protectionism. People turned inward. They blamed foreigners, elites, or systems they didn't understand. We're seeing the exact same sentiment growing again right now. Distrust in institutions, anger at inequality, fear of change. Economic insecurity breeds political extremism. History warns us very clearly about what follows when economic pain meets desperate politics. In 1929, speculation was visible and physical. Crowds gathered outside brokerage houses, watching ticker tapes roll by. There was a human element to it. Today, speculation is purely digital. Instant trades, algorithmic betting, derivatives stacked upon derivatives stacked upon derivatives. The speed magnifies the fragility exponentially. When sentiment turns negative, there's no time to react thoughtfully. Markets move faster than human comprehension. The velocity virtually guarantees that the next crash, when it comes, will spread globally before most people even realize it's begun. But perhaps the most dangerous parallel of all lies in human psychology. Before every major collapse in history, people feel safest. They believe in progress, in technology, in human control over complex systems. They dismiss warnings as pessimism or fear-mongering. In the 1920s, investors who sold their stocks early were openly mocked as cowards or fools. In 2025, people who talk about bubbles and systemic risk face the same ridicule. Confidence blinds us. Complacency builds slowly. And then, one day, something breaks. A default, a failed auction, a sudden loss of liquidity. And the illusion evaporates instantly. Yet history isn't destiny. It doesn't have to be. The lessons exist. They're written clearly in the historical record. Diversify risk. Question consensus thinking. Understand that value depends on trust, and trust depends on discipline. The system doesn't fail when markets fall. It fails when people forget why markets rose in the first place. In 1929, literally nobody imagined a decade-long depression. It was unthinkable. In 2025, few people can imagine the same thing happening now. And that's precisely what makes this echo so dangerous. Familiarity breeds blindness. When the dust finally settled after 1929, it wasn't just investment portfolios that were destroyed. It was faith itself. Faith in the market, in leadership, in the promise that hard work alone could secure prosperity and a better future. The collapse forced entire nations to reconsider everything they believed about money, power, and the role of government. The United States reinvented itself through the New Deal. It introduced financial regulation, deposit insurance, and social safety nets. These reforms didn't end the Depression immediately, but they slowed the bleeding and established new rules. For the first time in American history, the government accepted direct responsibility for economic stability. But even those solutions carried the seeds of future fragility. Once governments learned they could manipulate markets to create stability, they never stopped. Look at where we are now. The foundations built in the 1930s still shape everything about our present economic reality. Central banks create unlimited liquidity when panic hits. Governments spend trillions to stimulate demand. Investors expect rescue packages as a given. The moral hazard is now permanent. Risk gets socialized and spread across society. Rewards remain private and concentrated. In 1929, this would have been completely unthinkable. In 2025, it's just assumed to be normal. This is how history drifts over time. Emergency measures become permanent doctrine. What was once exceptional becomes routine and expected. The Depression taught world leaders one crystal-clear lesson: deflation kills economies. When prices fall, people hoard money instead of spending it. Businesses delay investment. Unemployment spirals out of control. To prevent that nightmare, modern economies now accept inflation as completely normal. But this tolerance has massive hidden costs. Persistent inflation erodes savings. It rewards debtors and punishes savers. It shifts wealth silently upward, from workers to asset owners, from the prudent to the reckless. The system now completely depends on this hidden transfer. It cannot allow prices to fall, even when economic fundamentals desperately demand correction. That's why every crisis today ends with bailouts instead of bankruptcies. We've removed failure from the equation, and without failure, there's no discipline. The Great Depression didn't just reshape economies, it reshaped geopolitics forever. Economic collapse fueled aggressive nationalism. It drove protectionism and trade wars. Desperate populations embraced strongmen who promised certainty and simple solutions to complex problems. In our time, the parallels grow sharper every single day. Economic anxiety is breeding political extremes across the globe. Populism rises on both the left and right. Trust in democratic institutions fades. When people lose hope in fair opportunity and upward mobility, they seek control. Any kind of control. That was true in 1933, it's just as true now. So where does all of this leave us? The global economy stands at a familiar edge. Growth is slowing. Debt keeps climbing. Inequality fuels anger and resentment. Institutions strain under pressure. Technology accelerates everything, including collapse. The pattern is ancient, but the context is entirely new. The Great Depression taught that collapse isn't only financial, it's moral. When trust erodes completely, entire systems crumble. The challenge we face today is preserving that trust before another reckoning forces painful renewal. As debt mounts higher, as speculation grows wilder, and as inequality deepens further, we have to ask ourselves hard questions.
Are we actually wiser than the people who lived through 1929? Or are we just repeating their exact mistakes while wearing better suits and staring at nicer screens? If you followed along this far, I want you to do something. Take a moment and look at your own economy, your savings, your prices, your opportunities. The ghost of 1929 isn't trapped in history books. It's alive in every decision to chase profit without foundation, to ignore warnings for the sake of comfort, to treat speculation as if it were real growth. Crashes don't emerge from nowhere. They grow quietly inside collective belief, inside shared delusion. So ask yourself honestly, if the exact conditions of 1929 returned tomorrow, would we even notice? Or have we built a system so complex, so confident in its own brilliance, that it can no longer see its own reflection in the mirror? Your answer to that question may decide whether the next decade repeats the past or finally learns from it. If this video made you think differently about today's economy, about your future, about what's really happening behind the headlines, I want to hear from you. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Are we wiser now, or are we just walking the same path in better shoes? Your perspective genuinely matters, because history isn't over. It's not something that happened to other people in old photographs. It's repeating right now, in slow motion, all around us. And if this kind of content makes you think, if it challenges what you hear everywhere else, then subscribe, because there's a lot more coming. The question isn't whether another crash is coming. The question is whether you'll see it before it arrives.